Since the gates of Eden closed behind fallen humanity, one law has ruled the earth with unbroken authority. Every child born of woman has entered a world already claimed by death. Kings built empires and still descended into silence. Prophets heard the voice of God and still returned to dust. Priests stood before holy fire and still felt the breath leave their lungs. The strong, the wise, the chosen, the feared, the beloved, all of them bowed to the same final sentence. No crown could resist it. No anointing could delay it forever. No prayer could cancel it. Death remained the single undefeated monarch of human history. That is what makes this story so unsettling. Because there was one man who did not follow the pattern. One man who reached the edge where every other life had ended, and then did something no other mortal had done in the same way. He did not sink into old age and vanish into a grave. He did not die with family gathered around his bed. He did not receive burial rites. He did not leave this world with the quiet dignity people prefer when they speak about holy men. His departure was not gentle. It was not soft. It was not framed in the tender colors of childhood imagination. It was raw power. It was terror. It was disruption. It was heaven breaking into the natural order with enough force to tear a human being out of it. His name was Elijah. You may have heard the story before and pictured it like a peaceful ascent, almost like a painting hanging in a Sunday school room. A prophet, a glowing sky, a chariot of fire lifting him upward in radiant calm. But the text does not offer that kind of comfort. It does not read like a lullaby. It reads like an intrusion. It reads like an event so violent and so supernatural that the man who saw it with his own eyes did not stand there smiling in wonder. He cried out. He tore his clothes. He watched something happen that no human language could fully contain. A chariot of fire appeared. Horses of fire appeared. But the fire did not come to cradle Elijah in some serene and golden farewell. It came to divide, to separate, to draw a line between one man and another, between earth and heaven, between what is flesh and what is about to be seized by the unbearable force of God. Then came the whirlwind, not as a breeze, not as a symbol, but as a supernatural eruption of power. Elijah was taken from the surface of the earth in the presence of his disciple, removed from the common destiny of mankind. That is why this story has echoed across centuries with such unsettling force. Elijah did not merely escape danger. He broke the oldest pattern in the human race. He crossed the boundary every other man had been forced to cross through death. And yet, he crossed it alive. This is not just the story of a prophet who left the earth strangely. This is the story of a man singled out by God for something so extraordinary that the normal laws governing human endings no longer applied to him. And when a man departs like that, the question is no longer whether his life was unusual. The question becomes, why? Because men are not taken alive by heaven for no reason. Unlike Moses, Elijah arrived without a cradle story. No genealogy opens his path. No mother's tears. No father's name. No tribe carefully traced through generations. Scripture does not slow down for him the way it does for kings and lawgivers. It does not build a platform beneath his feet. It does not prepare the audience with sacred background music. It simply throws him into the scene like a blade drawn in darkness. Now Elijah the Tishbite, of Tishbe in Gilead. That is almost all the introduction he gets. And in that very sparseness, something unsettling begins to take shape. The Bible often lingers over origins, because origins explain identity. But Elijah is introduced like a man whose identity is not rooted in family prestige, political lineage, or institutional approval. He does not seem to come from the center. He comes from the edges, from Gilead, from rough country, from hard soil, from a land of stone, wind, exposure, and survival. He enters the narrative not like a court prophet polished by royal culture, but like a wilderness force that has crossed the boundary between isolation and power. He appears, and almost immediately, he speaks judgment. No hesitation, no ceremony, no request for permission. He walks into the presence of King Ahab, the most powerful ruler in the northern kingdom, and delivers a sentence that strikes at the sky itself. There will be no dew, no rain, not for years, not until the word in his mouth releases it. Try to see the shock of that moment as the first hearers would have felt it. A man with no visible army, no office, no banner, no royal favor, no priestly title steps into the throne room and speaks as if heaven itself is standing behind him. He does not flatter the king. He does not negotiate with power. He confronts it with the calm certainty of someone who fears God more than death. Then, as suddenly as he came, he vanishes. And that vanishing matters. Because Elijah was not merely sent to preach, he was deployed in a way that made him impossible to control. Ahab could threaten priests. He could buy officials. He could silence dissent within cities and sanctuaries. But how do you capture a man who belongs to no visible system? How do you pressure someone who arrives with no family presented for leverage, no institution to dismantle, no chain of command to infiltrate? Elijah moves like an agent concealed inside the will of God, hidden by a brook, fed by ravens, relocated without warning, sustained in places no king would think to search. He is not simply a prophet in the ordinary sense. He feels like heaven's asymmetric weapon, untraceable, unpurchasable, uncompromising. He carries the rugged anonymity of the desert and the terrifying authority of divine commission. Nothing in his presentation suggests comfort, polish, or diplomacy. Everything about him suggests interruption. He is what God sends when corruption has become too entrenched for ordinary remedies. That is what makes his arrival so severe. Elijah does not emerge to participate in the machinery of the age. He emerges to confront it. He is not introduced as a man rising through ranks. He is introduced as a force breaking into history from outside the structures that men trust. And when a figure like that walks out of the wilderness and into the court of a king, it means the crisis is already far deeper than the palace, yet understands Israel was not merely drifting in those days. Drift is slow. Drift is careless. Drift suggests a people who lost their way by accident. But what unfolded under Ahab and Jezebel was not an accident. It was construction. It was strategy. It was the deliberate redesign of a covenant nation until the worship of the living God was pushed to the margins and the machinery of power served another altar. Ahab sat on the throne, but the throne was not the whole problem. He was weak in the place where a king must be strong. He wore authority, but he did not guard it with righteousness. Scripture delivers its verdict on him with terrifying severity, declaring that he provoked the Lord more than all the kings of Israel before him. Not most, not many, all. His reign did not merely continue corruption, it intensified it until the nation itself began to lose its spiritual memory. And beside him stood Jezebel. She did not enter Israel as a passive queen, adapting to a foreign land. She came as an invading will. She carried Phoenicia in her blood and Baal in her hands. She did not simply prefer another religion. She weaponized it. She understood what many rulers understand better than the people they govern. If you control worship, you can reshape identity. If you control the altar, you can eventually control the conscience. So she did not aim at surface behavior alone. She aimed at the soul of the nation. This is where the air turns suffocating. Because once the court embraced Baal, the infection spread downward through every layer of public life. Sacred symbols changed. Loyalties shifted. The fear of God was replaced by the fear of the regime. Prophets of the Lord were no longer inconvenient voices to be ignored. They became targets to be erased. Jezebel launched a purge. Men who had spoken in the name of Yahweh were hunted like fugitives. The state itself became an instrument of religious extermination. And hidden inside that darkness was a man named Obadiah, a palace official forced to live with the terror of divided visibility. Outwardly, he served in the house of power. In secret, he preserved the servants of God. By night, while death prowled the corridors of policy and decree, he hid 100 prophets in caves and brought them bread and water. Try to feel the weight of that image. A land, once marked by covenant truth, had become so hostile to its own God that his prophets survived like hunted animals in stone chambers, breathing in shadows, waiting for footsteps that could mean death. That is not spiritual decline. That is occupation of the heart. And perhaps that is the warning that presses hardest against you now. A nation rarely falls all at once. It is hollowed out first. Language remains. Ritual may remain. Public order may remain. But underneath, something sacred has been displaced. That was Israel under Ahab and Jezebel, a kingdom still standing in stone while collapsing in spirit. The darkness was not only political, it was theological, it was domestic. It entered households, altars, imaginations, and futures. The land did not simply have bad leadership, it was being taught to love what destroys and fear what saves. And when a people are trained to call darkness holy, judgment no longer approaches as a distant possibility. It begins to gather like a storm behind the hills, waiting for the moment when heaven will answer what the earth has become. To understand why fire fell from heaven, you must first understand what had risen from the earth. This was never a harmless clash of religious preferences. It was not one altar competing politely with another. It was not incense drifting through a shrine while priests murmured empty chants. What entered Israel under the banner of Baal was something darker, bloodier, and far more ravenous than modern ears are usually prepared to hear. Baal worship promised power. That is how darkness always enters. It rarely introduces itself as ruin. It arrives dressed as fertility, prosperity, rain, harvest, protection, pleasure, control. It tells a frightened people that if they bow low enough, pay enough, surrender enough, the heavens will open and life will become manageable again. But idols never bless without demanding flesh. The deeper Israel moved into this system, the more it became clear that Baal was not simply a false god. He was a consuming counterfeit, an altar built to train people to offer what should never be offered. And at the center of that terror stood the most horrifying sacrifice of all, children. The worship was not symbolic. It was not metaphorical. It was not some abstract act of spiritual confusion. Innocence was fed into the machinery of devotion. Infants and little ones became offerings in rituals so twisted that even the language used to describe them feels scorched. Fire was no longer the sign of God's holiness. In the hands of idolaters, fire became the appetite of a system that devoured the weak so the powerful could feel secure. Parents were told that surrendering what was most precious might purchase favor from the heavens. That is what sin does when it matures. It does not stop at personal corruption. It becomes organized cruelty. It sanctifies evil. It teaches human beings to call brutality worship. So when Jezebel imported the prophets of Baal and enthroned this religion inside the covenant nation, she was not merely introducing new ceremonies. She was laying siege to the moral structure of Israel itself. She was normalizing what heaven abhors. She was planting a theology that could smile in public while blood cried out in secret. That is why the land was not merely confused. It was defiled. The issue was no longer theological error alone. It was moral contamination on a national scale. You need to see this clearly, because many people want a God who judges nothing. They want divine patience without divine holiness, mercy without wrath, compassion without confrontation. But a God who watches children burn and never answers is not loving. A God who sees darkness enthroned and remains forever silent is not righteous. There comes a point when fire is not cruelty from heaven. Fire is testimony. Fire is verdict. Fire is the public declaration that the living God will not share his glory with demons and will not bless a system built on the destruction of the innocent. That is why the coming confrontation could not remain a matter of debate. Words had been spoken. Warnings had been given. Prophets had been hunted. Altars had been polluted. Blood had soaked into the ground. The conflict had ripened beyond negotiation. Israel stood between two kingdoms, two fires, two claims to ultimate authority. One would consume children in darkness. The other would answer in blazing holiness before the eyes of a nation. And when that hour arrived, every false promise built by Baal would be forced to stand naked beneath the sky. Mount Carmel rose above the land like a courtroom prepared for judgment. The drought had already stripped Israel down to exposed nerves. The earth had cracked beneath the sun. Rivers had thinned. Fields had failed. Every hungry mouth in the nation was living inside the consequence of a word Elijah had spoken years before. And now, at last, the silence would be tested in public. Elijah stood alone. Across from him stood 450 prophets of Baal. The full religious machinery of a corrupted kingdom gathered in one place, dressed in confidence, backed by royal power, surrounded by a watching nation that no longer knew how to choose. That may be the most dangerous condition of all. When people are not openly rebellious, only divided, wavering, suspended between truth and spectacle. Elijah looked at them and asked the question like a blade laid against the throat of a generation. How long will you limp between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. No one answered. That silence said everything. Then the terms were set. 2 bulls, 2 altars. No human hand would light the fire. The God who answered by fire would be revealed as God indeed. It was simple enough for a child to understand, and severe enough to expose a nation. Baal's prophets went first, because falsehood always demands the stage before truth steps forward. Morning stretched into noon. Noon dragged toward evening. They shouted until their throats frayed. They danced around the altar with increasing desperation, circling emptiness as though movement could create power. Sweat ran down their bodies. Dust rose beneath their feet. Their voices turned raw. Still nothing. No spark. No whisper. No answer. Then came the blood. In a frenzy of ritual violence, they cut themselves with swords and spears, slashing skin as if pain itself could force heaven to respond. Blood ran over their arms and legs, spilled onto the stones, darkened the ground beneath them. The sight was ghastly, but the altar remained cold. Their God received their wounds and gave them nothing. This is what idols do. They take your strength, your peace, your body, your future, and when the hour of need arrives, they remain silent. Elijah began to mock them, and the mockery was merciless. Cry louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought. Perhaps he is traveling. Perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. The prophet was not entertaining the crowd. He was publicly dismantling the illusion that had enslaved a nation. Then he stepped forward. He rebuilt the altar of the Lord with 12 stones, one for every tribe, as though reminding Israel that covenant identity still existed beneath the ashes. He laid the wood in order. He placed the sacrifice upon it, and then, in a move so irrational it could only have come from absolute certainty, he commanded that water be poured over everything. Once, twice, 3 times, water over the offering, water over the wood, water over the stones until the trench overflowed and the altar stood drenched beyond all human usefulness. Then Elijah prayed. No frenzy, no performance, no blood, just a few measured words offered to the God who does not need to be manipulated. And in an instant, heaven answered. Fire fell with terrifying authority. It consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the dust, and even the water in the trench. Nothing remained untouched. The people collapsed with their faces to the ground and cried out that the Lord, He is God. On Carmel, the sky gave its verdict, and the lie that had ruled Israel could no longer hide behind ritual, noise, or power. Victory can be more dangerous than defeat when the human body has already spent everything it had to survive the battle. On Mount Carmel, Elijah had stood like a pillar of fire in human form. He had faced a nation that could not decide what it believed, mocked the prophets of Baal before the eyes of the crowd, and called down the unbearable answer of heaven. In that moment, he seemed untouchable. He looked like the kind of man fear could no longer reach. The fire had fallen. The people had collapsed. The lie had been exposed. If anyone had looked at Elijah then, they would have thought they were seeing a prophet carried by unshakable strength. But moments like that can deceive you, because public triumph does not always reveal private condition. Sometimes the soul is still standing only because the crisis has not yet given it permission to collapse. Sometimes a man is held upright by urgency, by holy rage, by adrenaline, by the sheer force of obedience in the middle of confrontation. And when the noise fades, when the crowd disperses, when the body realizes it is no longer required to perform, the crash comes with terrifying speed. That is exactly what happened to Elijah. The report reached Jezebel. Ahab told her everything. He told her about the shattered prophets, the fire, the humiliation, the public collapse of the cult she had built. And Jezebel did not scream. She did not mourn. She did not gather troops in panic. She sent a message, just words. One sentence sharpened into a weapon. By the next day, she swore Elijah would be dead like the men who had fallen. That was all. No army marched. No blade touched his skin. No hand was laid upon him. And yet the words landed with more force than a spear. This is how spiritual exhaustion works. The man who can stand before hundreds may still shatter when the last reserve inside him is gone. The body cannot run forever on miracle and intensity. The nerves burn out. The mind begins to distort danger. Fear enters through cracks that were invisible during the fight. So Elijah ran. The prophet who had stood before kings now fled for his life. He crossed distance with the desperation of a hunted man, moving south until civilization thinned and the wilderness opened around him. He left his servant behind, as broken people often do when they no longer have strength to be seen. Then he went farther, deeper into the barren solitude, until he found a broom tree and dropped beneath its thin shadow like a man whose inner world had finally caved in. There, stripped of momentum, stripped of spectacle, stripped of all the thunder that had surrounded his calling, Elijah spoke from the bottom of his exhaustion. He had had enough. Enough danger. Enough pressure. Enough struggle. Enough carrying the weight of a nation's rebellion in his own trembling body. He asked God to take his life, not dramatically, not for effect, but with the raw honesty of someone who no longer knew how to keep going. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. The prophet who had called fire from heaven was now lying in the dust, asking for death. The man who had seen God answer in public power could no longer find enough strength to survive his own private darkness. If you had found him there, you would not have seen a legend. You would have seen a human being emptied beyond language. And in that scorched silence, with no audience left and no strength remaining, heaven drew near in a way Elijah did not yet understand. What happened beneath that broom tree reveals something about God that exhausted people often forget. Elijah had asked to die, and heaven did not answer him with thunder. There was no rebuke crashing down from the sky. No stern lecture about courage. No holy disappointment poured over the head of a prophet who had finally collapsed. God did not stand over his broken servant and demand a better attitude. He did not say, "Try harder." He did not say, "Have more faith." He did not say, "After all I have shown you, how dare you fall apart now?" Instead, heaven came close in gentleness. An angel touched him. That detail matters more than many people realize. Elijah was not approached as a criminal, not handled as a failure, not treated as a spiritual embarrassment. He was touched in the middle of dust, fear, dehydration, and emotional ruin. The first response of God was not accusation but care. And beside him appeared what his body needed more than any sermon in that moment: bread baked on hot coals and a jar of water. Not revelation first, not instruction first. Bread, water, rest. You need to let that sink in. The prophet, who had stood before kings, who had confronted idolatry, who had called down fire from heaven, had been reduced to a body trembling in the wilderness. And God, who understands the frame he himself created, did not confuse physical collapse with spiritual rebellion. He saw what exhaustion had done. He saw the nerves frayed raw, the muscles emptied, the mind darkened by terror and depletion. So the angel gave him food and let him sleep. That sleep was not a delay in the story. It was ministry. Elijah drank and lay down again. No speech, no demand, no pressure to perform, just the quiet mercy of being allowed to rest while heaven watched over him. Then the angel returned a second time and touched him again. The voice came not with condemnation but with provision. Rise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. There is so much tenderness in that sentence. Not, you are weak. Not, you should have endured better. But, the journey is too great for you. In other words, this burden would crush any human being without help. Your limits are real. Your weakness is not imaginary. You are not crazy for feeling what you feel. You are carrying more than flesh can bear on its own. This is one of the most astonishing movements in the whole story. God responded to Elijah's desire to die by strengthening him to live. But he did it through the humble things proud minds often overlook: warm bread, cool water, deep sleep, repeated care. Heaven did not begin with the prophet's theology. Heaven began with his humanity. And hidden inside that mercy was a mystery Elijah could not yet see. God was refusing to grant the death Elijah had requested, not out of cold silence, but out of a purpose far larger than the despair of that single afternoon. What felt like unanswered pain was already being held inside a wiser compassion. Elijah could not read that yet. All he knew was that strength was slowly returning. Enough to rise. Enough to move. Enough to keep following the hand that had not abandoned him in the desert. And when a man begins to stand again after asking to disappear, it means God is preparing to speak into the silence that almost swallowed him whole. The end did not come upon Elijah like decay. It came with awareness. By then, the wilderness years had passed through him like fire through iron. He had known confrontation, terror, exhaustion, and the strange tenderness of God in silence. He had heard the voice that does not compete with storms. He had laid his mantle upon Elisha, and in that act, something holy and irreversible had begun to shift. The work was moving forward. But Elijah himself had also begun to move toward a boundary unlike any other man's. He did not make that final journey in confusion. There was weight in the air, the kind that settles before a moment heaven has already marked. He walked with Elisha beside him, and 3 times he told the younger man to remain behind. "Stay here. The Lord has sent me onward." It was said first with the stillness of one testing love, then again with the gravity of one carrying a secret too heavy for ordinary speech, and then once more, as though the road itself was narrowing into something only obedience could cross. But Elisha refused every time. "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." That answer mattered. Loyalty was walking beside mystery. Devotion was refusing distance. Elisha did not fully understand what the day would require, but he understood enough to know that sacred departures are not moments for half-hearted presence. So they went on together, step by step, from Gilgal to Bethel, from Bethel to Jericho, from Jericho to the Jordan, moving through a land that seemed to feel the tension of the hour. Along the way, the sons of the prophets came near and whispered to Elisha, not with joy, but with the hush that attends an approaching rupture. "Did you know that the Lord will take your master from over you today?" Again and again the same question came, like an echo moving through human voices. Again and again Elisha answered with restrained pain, "Yes, I know. Be quiet." The whole prophetic community seemed to sense that something unprecedented was gathering just beyond sight. Then they reached the Jordan. There, at the edge of the river, Elijah took his mantle, rolled it tightly in his hand, and struck the water. Immediately, the current broke apart. The river opened before them, not in symbol, not in sentiment, but in visible submission to the God who rules creation. The 2 men crossed on dry ground, and the moment trembled with memory. Water had once parted for Moses. Water had once parted for Joshua. And now, in the fading light of Elijah's earthly walk, the same power answered again. Heaven was not allowing this servant to slip quietly from history. The scene was being framed with the weight of covenant, the authority of remembrance, and the majesty of divine intention. When they had crossed, Elijah spoke to Elisha with solemn generosity, asking what should be done for him before he was taken away. There was no fear in the request, only finality. Elisha answered with the boldness of one who knew he was asking for more than inheritance. He asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, not wealth, not title, not comfort. Spirit, calling, strength for a road that would not be easier simply because Elijah was leaving it. And there, beyond the river, with heaven pressing close and the last exchange between master and disciple hanging in the air, the world stood on the edge of something it had never seen before. They were still walking when the rupture came. There was no long warning, no slow unfolding of comfort, no gentle softening of the sky. One moment, Elijah and Elisha were moving side by side in the ordinary rhythm of final conversation, and the next, the boundary between the visible world and the unseen kingdom was torn open with terrifying force. A chariot of fire appeared. Horses of fire appeared. Not imagined fire, not symbolic warmth, fire with the violence of holiness. Fire that did not drift into the scene like decoration, but crashed into it like a divine incursion. And the first thing it did was divide. That is the detail many people hurry past. But Scripture does not. The chariot and the horses of fire separated the two men. They came between master and disciple, between the one who was being taken and the one who would remain. The fire did not arrive as a soft vehicle of comfort. It arrived like a barrier, like a living wall, like heaven drawing a line no human foot could cross. In that instant, Elisha could no longer follow where love would have gone if love alone had power enough. Then the whirlwind came. Not a breeze, not a poetic gust, a whirlwind, a violent, supernatural vortex breaking into the natural order with the force of command. The ground itself must have seemed unstable beneath the weight of that moment. The air turned into motion. Sound became pressure. Light and force converged. Elijah was not described as climbing. He was not said to have mounted the chariot. He was taken up in the whirlwind, seized, lifted, drawn out of the world. Men know by a power no human body could resist. This was no peaceful fading. It was extraction. If you had stood there beside Elisha, you would not have had tidy language for what your eyes were seeing. You would not have whispered a comfortable sentence and nodded in calm understanding. You would have trembled. You would have felt the terror that always accompanies unfiltered holiness. Because this was not merely a prophet dying well. This was a man being removed from the human condition in full view of another human being. The oldest law of the fallen earth was being interrupted before open eyes. And Elisha understood enough to break. He cried out with the anguish of a son watching the world split open above him. My father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. He did not call Elijah merely a teacher. In that cry was love, grief, awe, and the sudden recognition that the true defense of Israel had never been its armies, its walls, or its kings. The real chariots and horsemen of the nation had been bound up in the presence of God, resting upon one faithful prophet. Then Elisha tore his clothes in two, because some moments shatter the soul too deeply for quiet sorrow. And after the fire, after the whirlwind, after the cry, there was absence. Elijah was gone. No body fell back to earth. No grave remained behind. No burial site would become a monument for future generations. The place where every other story ends was left empty. Heaven had taken him beyond the reach of dust, beyond the slow surrender to decay, beyond the ordinary sentence carried by Adam's children. And standing there on the other side of the river, with torn garments and a mantle soon to be lifted from the ground, Elisha faced the terrible silence that remains when God has done something no man can undo. After the whirlwind, Elijah vanished so completely that the earth seemed to swallow the sound of his name. No grave marked his resting place. No final speech echoed through the generations. No closing chapter explained where he had gone. There was only absence. And then there was silence. Not the silence of a few forgotten seasons, but the long, grinding silence of centuries. 900 years passed. That is long enough for kingdoms to become ruins and for ruins to become dust. Long enough for children to be born, grow old, and die without ever seeing the world their ancestors knew. During those centuries, the map of history convulsed again and again. The northern kingdom fell beneath Assyria. Judah was crushed by Babylon. Solomon's temple burned, its stones broken, its songs choked by exile and tears. Empires rose with the arrogance of permanence and then collapsed into memory. Persia ruled. Greece thundered across the earth under Alexander and shattered after his death. Rome tightened its iron grip around the known world. Generations lived and vanished. Armies marched. Languages spread. Thrones changed hands. The world kept moving. But Elijah did not return to ordinary history. You would have thought the story was over. You would have thought that whatever had happened to him beyond the sight of Elisha was sealed away forever in the hidden counsels of God. The prophet taken alive had become a mystery too deep for human hands to reach. Centuries went dark around him. The earth turned without explanation. And yet, heaven had not misplaced him for a single moment. Then, on a mountain in Galilee, the silence broke. Jesus took Peter, James, and John up with him, away from the noise below, away from the ordinary rhythm of the crowds. There, in that elevated solitude, something happened that no human being could have manufactured and no imagination could safely contain. The appearance of Jesus changed before them. His face shone like the sun. His garments blazed with a whiteness no earthly process could produce. Light was not falling on him from elsewhere. Light was coming out of him, as though the glory hidden beneath flesh had suddenly torn through the veil. And standing there beside him were two men, Moses and Elijah. Moses, the giver of the law, the one who had died and been buried by God himself. Eliah, the prophet who had never passed through death in the ordinary way at all. Law and prophecy, both gathered around Christ like witnesses summoned by eternity. And Elijah stood there not as a fading memory, not as a symbol, not as a legend resurrected by storytelling, but alive, present, conscious, speaking with Jesus as though 900 years had not diminished him by even a breath. That is what makes the moment so staggering. Time had not consumed him. History had not erased him. The silence had not meant abandonment. All those centuries in which empires screamed and vanished had not moved heaven into forgetfulness. Elijah had been kept, preserved, held in readiness by the God who wastes nothing and forgets no servant he has chosen. And if you had been standing there with the disciples, trembling in the blaze of that mountain, you would have realized that Elijah's disappearance had never been an ending. It had been a suspension, a hidden interval, a pause inside a larger design that was only beginning to reveal its shape in the radiance surrounding the Son of God. The Old Testament does not close with comfort. It closes with a warning. That alone should make you stop and listen. After generations of rebellion, exile, return, rebuilding, priestly failure, and spiritual fatigue, you might expect the final prophetic voice of that age to offer a soft benediction, a gentle sentence to ease the people into silence. But the closing words do not feel gentle. They feel like a door shutting with thunder behind it. They carry the weight of unfinished business, the tremor of judgment not yet spent, the sense that history itself is holding its breath for something still unresolved. And at the center of that final warning stands a name already wrapped in fire: Eliah. Not a memory merely honored, not a prophet respectfully archived in the sacred past, not a figure sealed in legend and left behind as the generations moved on. The last prophetic words of the Old Testament point forward to him with deliberate force, declaring that Elijah will come before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. That is not the language of retirement. That is not how heaven speaks about a servant whose work is complete. That is the language of recall, the language of summons, the language of a mission interrupted, not ended. This changes the meaning of everything. Because if Elijah's departure had been only reward, then the story could have closed with rest. If he had simply been taken because his labor was over, the prophets could have honored him as a wonder and let his name settle into reverent silence. But the last words of the age refuse to let him fade. They place him at the edge of a coming day so severe that families, nations, and hearts themselves are drawn into the warning. Elijah is bound to a future hour of reckoning. His name is stitched into the tension between mercy and judgment, restoration and ruin. He will turn the hearts of fathers to their children, and the hearts of children to their fathers. That is not small language. Heaven is not speaking merely of public religion or ceremonial reform. It is speaking of fracture at the deepest human level. When God prepares for a dreadful day, he does not begin with surface polish. He aims at the heart. He addresses rupture where it lives most intimately, in loyalty, inheritance, tenderness, memory, and covenant connection. Elijah is named as the prophet who will stand in that breach, not merely condemning, not merely announcing wrath, turning hearts, confronting the interior collapse that always precedes visible judgment. And yet the warning remains severe. If this turning does not come, the land itself stands beneath the threat of a curse. That is how the Old Testament ends, not with resolution, but with tension, not with closure, but with a suspended sentence hanging over history. The silence that follows is not empty, it is charged. It is the kind of silence that forms when a king has spoken and the court must wait for the appointed hour. So Elijah remains more than a prophet of the past. He becomes a living sign that God is not finished with his own word, taken from the earth, withheld from decay, named again at the edge of the canon. He stands like a torch held just outside the visible frame of history. And if you listen carefully to the way the Old Testament ends, you can hear it. The sound is not farewell. It is expectation. It is the hush before a name once carried by whirlwind is called again into the center of divine purpose. In the closing vision of human rebellion, when the earth hardens itself against God with a final and terrible boldness, Scripture opens a scene so severe that it feels less like poetry and more like a war briefing from heaven. Two witnesses rise in Jerusalem. Not one voice, but two, not hidden in caves, not whispering from the margins, but standing in the center of prophetic collision where history strains toward its last convulsions. They speak in the shadow of global darkness. And for 1260 days, the world is forced to reckon with their presence. That number is not accidental. It is exact, 3.5 years. The same span that once marked Elijah's drought now appears again with mathematical precision. Like a signature laid across the page of prophecy, the pattern is too sharp to ignore. These witnesses are given authority not merely to preach, but to confront creation itself. The sky closes above them so that no rain falls during the days of their testimony. Fire devours those who rise against them. Judgment moves with their words. Heaven and earth respond to them as though ancient authority has stepped back into the world, clothed once more in flesh and commission. And if you have followed the trail carefully, the shape becomes unmistakable. Who was it that once shut the heavens over a rebellious land so that no rain fell for years? Elijah. Who was it that called down fire in the face of defiance, proving that the living God does not answer to idols or to kings? Elijah. The prophetic pattern returns with such force that his shadow is no longer a shadow at all. It feels like continuation, like unfinished business brought forward to its appointed hour. The other witness carries signs no less terrible. Waters turned to blood, plagues released upon the earth, judgment falling with the memory of Egypt still burning in the background of Scripture's great story. This is why so many have looked at the final witness pair and seen not random symbolism, but convergence. Law and prophets, Moses and Elijah. The same two figures who once stood beside Christ in unveiled glory, now appearing again in the moral center of history's last rebellion, not to decorate the scene, but to confront it. And this is where the true meaning of Elijah's life rises into view. He was never merely a prophet for one generation. He was never only the man of Carmel, only the fugitive of the wilderness, only the servant taken in fire. His life was shaped like a weapon held in reserve by God. Even his exhaustion was not the end of him. Even his disappearance was not retirement. Heaven did not preserve Elijah because heaven is sentimental. Heaven preserved him because heaven is purposeful. His story was stretched beyond the limits of ordinary human biography and tied to a conflict larger than any single king, queen, drought, or mountain. That is why the deepest meaning of Elijah's life is not found only in what he survived, or even in how he departed. It is found in the terrifying consistency of divine purpose. God does not waste broken servants. He does not lose the thread of a calling just because centuries pass. He can suspend a life in mystery and then bring it forward again when the hour demands fire, truth, and fearless witness. So, when you look at Elijah, you are not looking only at a man from the ancient world. You are looking at a life that God refused to close on human terms. A voice carried beyond time because its final echo belongs to the last great confrontation between heaven's authority and earth's rebellion. Under the broom tree, Elijah had believed the verdict was already written. He had believed the silence meant failure. He had believed exhaustion was the same thing as the end. The dust beneath him felt final. The loneliness felt final. The unanswered ache in his chest felt final. In that moment, he could not see beyond the collapse of his own strength. He could not imagine that heaven might still be writing while he was begging for the page to close. To Elijah, it seemed mercy would look like death. To God, mercy looked like refusal. And that difference changed everything. Because there are moments when a human being reaches the edge of what the soul can carry and mistakes that edge for destiny. You may know that place more intimately than you wish you did. The place where prayers feel heavy, where memory becomes painful, where yesterday's victories cannot warm today's coldness, where even faith begins to feel like a language spoken by someone else. Elijah knew that place. The great prophet did not stand above human weakness, as if chosen people were carved from harder material. He fell into the same dark valley where so many have fallen after fighting too long, carrying too much, hoping too hard. But the mercy of God was already moving toward him while he was still asking to disappear. That is the message hidden in the shadow of the broom tree. The prayer God did not answer was not rejected because it was unheard. It was refused because it was too small for the future God was protecting. Elijah could see only the wilderness around him. God could see the mountain, the river, the fire, the glory, the years yet unwritten, the purpose still waiting beyond Elijah's despair. What felt like abandonment was actually preservation. What felt like silence was restraint. Heaven was not neglecting him. Heaven was refusing to let one moment of agony cancel a calling that stretched far beyond his imagination. And perhaps that is where this story reaches beyond Elijah and touches you. Because there are seasons when you sit beneath your own broom tree, even if no desert surrounds you. A season of private collapse. A season where the body is tired, the mind is crowded, the heart is thin, and you wonder why God is not granting the one thing you keep placing before him. You call it delay. You call it silence. You call it disappointment. But what if, from the side of heaven, it is mercy wearing unfamiliar clothes? What if the closed door is not punishment? What if the answer withheld is not cruelty? What if God is guarding a future you are too wounded to see clearly from where you lie? Elijah's story does not tell you that pain is unreal. It does not mock exhaustion. It does not pretend despair is shallow. It tells you something harder and holier. Your lowest moment is not always your truest ending. There are mercies that arrive disguised as interruption. There are rescues that first feel like refusal. There are futures being defended by a God who sees beyond the narrow horizon of human sorrow. So the broom tree remains one of the strangest holy places in Scripture, not because Elijah died there, but because he did not. Not because God abandoned him there, but because God met him there. And sometimes the greatest proof that God still has a purpose for a life is that he will not grant the despair that begs him to let it end.